I'm here with my friend Parker Lewis. Parker, you had a background before you got into Bitcoin in banking and finance, and now you have worked in a couple different areas in Bitcoin. A lot of people, when they hear Bitcoiners talking about fiat currency, debasement, inflation, they think, well, this system has been going for so long, aren't they trying to help us? I know good people that work in finance or in banking. Help us understand, before we get to Bitcoin and how it helps with a broken monetary system, help us understand why the current system is the way it is in terms of what problem are they trying to solve and what are the at least purported intentions behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the context, I came out of college, right before the great financial crisis, and I was working in a traditional financial institution, working at Deutsche Bank and investment banking on Wall Street, and I saw the world collapsing and crumbling in chaos, and I had no real concept of why what was happening was actually happening, despite having an economics degree from Duke University. Many years later, I went back to understand that before I even got to Bitcoin, and I was trained classically in Keynesian economics, and realistically, what the Fed and Treasury ultimately try to do via these operations is to smooth out what they referred to as business cycles, with the idea of trying to make the pain lessen in the bad times, right, and potentially moderate it in the good times, being a governor. And so they think of themselves as effectively smoothing out business cycles. That is what the Keynesian school of economics says is the right action to take. Right. And so they are doing it with, in my view, good intentions to say, in 2007 or 2008, rather than letting the housing market collapse, well, if we could just print a little bit of money, then we could save jobs in the construction business and smooth this out. Unfortunately, there's another school of economics that really is not taught and hasn't been taught for the last century that really explains from a fundamental perspective why manipulating the cost of money might reduce short-term pain, but it's really just suppressing volatility and creating a certainty of greater volatility in the end. The way I would describe that for someone from a basic economic perspective is, if you went and asked those same economics professors or practitioners at the Fed if it caused long-term damage to the oil market if you capped the price of oil, such that if you said, the maximum that a price of oil can be sold for is $50, when the market would dictate that it might be $100 or $120, you will ultimately get a shortage of oil. And they would say price fixing and setting rigid prices of goods will create larger market imbalances, which will make us all worse off.
This is the big problem with the Soviet Union and why it all fell apart.
Yeah, and they would say that if you fix price on rents, the same thing would happen, that you would be working against your interest of getting rents lower and more affordable. And then they abstract the layer to the money, and basically what they are effectively doing is price targeting the cost of money by literally making it up out of thin air, and I don't use that pejoratively. The way the operation actually works is that and the Fed will say this, they click a number on a computer screen and it's more akin to money printing than it is lending. But there's a logical disconnect on their own economic thought processes that is, well, if it doesn't make sense to price fix a good like oil or a good like real estate via rent, how then does it make sense to price fix the good that prices all other goods? And so what I would put forward, and what I do put forward in my work, is that by manipulating the money supply, they are price fixing money, and they are creating a market imbalance that is greater than all other market imbalances, because money is the good that prices all of it.
Right.
And so they're intending to smooth out business cycles, when in reality they're suppressing volatility, not smoothing out business cycles, and they're creating an environment where we can get the 2008 financial crisis, where we can get the 2020 collapse. Most people associate it with the government shutdown, but if people go back 6 months prior, there was a large disruption in one of the major funding markets that had nothing to do with the government shutdown or COVID. And even before COVID, there was a there was an imbalance in the oil market. And so these imbalances will exist because they exist as a function of money printing. And that's really what Bitcoin is intending to solve, saying you just can't mess with the money. Like, it wouldn't make sense if we had 100 friends for one of them to be able to create the money and effectively purchase the work of all other people in that 100 without doing any work themselves. And if it doesn't make sense for us to have 100 friends and bestow that power in one person, that again, there's not a logical connection to do that for an institution like the Fed. It just does not make fundamental rational economic sense.
Even with all the good intentions,
yes,
it falls apart eventually. Explain simply and briefly what it is about Bitcoin that's different than this, that fixes that.
What I would say is different about Bitcoin is that it, for the first time in the history of humanity, has engineered a form of money that is not in the control of any humans, can't be corrupted by any humans, only works because it is trustless, that the economic incentives are such that nobody can print money. Everybody can opt in voluntarily. You do not have to use the Bitcoin system if you don't want to, but if you do, that you are not capable of creating units of the currency arbitrarily. And what that ultimately affords is that everyone can voluntarily opt in to a form of money that nobody else can create.
Right. What is it about gold, which is, you know, a neutral commodity that's out there, there's nobody in charge of it, but gold, we think, has not worked very well for this. What is it about gold that made it not work?
Well, one of the things I would distinguish between gold and the dollar and Bitcoin, and this is something where I will try to say this in as non-academic way as possible, that gold was money and the dollar was currency.
Right.
Prior to Bitcoin, every form of money needed some currency issuer. It could have been, back in the day, a crown actually minting a gold coin. In the history of America, it was paper money that was backed by gold, but the dollar was the currency. And the thing that's different about Bitcoin is that it is both a money and a currency. It is able to function as a currency, and the way to think about this is that if you had the raw commodity gold, it needed to be refined into some sort of common unit. It needed to be stamped with a mark to say that this is actually gold, because gold is hard to determine that it's actually gold. And then there are other limitations of gold. It's difficult to transport. If you imagined settling oil globally, the gold has to exist somewhere physically, and you can't get gold from the Middle East to China. It's very costly to do that. Bitcoin solves the problem of allowing the money and the currency system to exist in one, where Bitcoin doesn't actually need a central third party to be the currency issuer. And if you go through the whole history of gold, there was always a currency issuer that refined the commodity to make it viable as a currency system, as what we actually get from the utility of money. Bitcoin detaches from that world. There's a unit of measure baked into the system, but the network itself validates the currency. You don't have to trust a third party to validate, is the gold really gold or is the dollar really a dollar? Which is difficult for people to detach, but essentially puts those two things, money and currency, in one system.
Great. Thanks, Parker. I appreciate your help.
Yeah.